In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, may the peace and blessings of Allah the Exalted be upon the Prophet Muhammad and his purified progeny, and may the damnation of Allah be upon their enemies. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our 15th episode. In the last episode we discussed the narrations of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam and how they told us that our conduct should be towards the ghulat, and that we should not strengthen the ghulat even if it be by a mere word. So we therefore concluded that one should not knowingly attend the gatherings of the exaggerators, and we should not have a lenient attitude towards them so that they come towards our gatherings, because when these extremists come towards our gatherings and mix within them, it is a prime opportunity for them to spread their disbelief and extremist ideology among the normal Shia. So Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, for example, mentioned that do not sit or eat with them, and this shows us that we should not just have normal relations with such extremists who are the ghulat, just like we would not sit and casually spend time with nawasib. So one can refer back to the last episode and see how we can implement these words of the Imams alayhim as-salam, and how we can distance ourselves from the ghulat as much as possible so that they do not corrupt the youth and so that they do not spread this cancerous ideology within our gatherings. But what I want to discuss in this episode, inshallah ta'ala, is the stance of the Shia scholars towards the ghulat. As we said, some may try to define Ghulu in different ways, but everyone has a consensus that ascribing divine lordship to any of the Imams or the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is an act of polytheism and shirk, and anyone who believes in Tawhid, that Allah Azza wa Jalla created them and then delegated all of the affairs of the creation to them, then they are also among that group of extremists and exaggerators. Everyone has a consensus that these people are ghulat and that we disassociate from them. And what we'll try to do as well is show some of these deviant eulogy reciters who have also uttered kufr and shirk in particular Shia gatherings. Some try to also portray that shirk is not the number one and greatest sin for the Shia Muslims. Now other sects try to talk about shirk when they themselves follow a beardless sky god with physical and limited features. So the biggest irony and audacity is for them to come and try criticize us of shirk. But what we must do as Shia is clean up our own house, meaning that if there is a rat that comes into your house or a rodent, you naturally will take out this rat or rodent and then dispose of them. So when it comes to the ideology of the ghulat, we must do the same and exterminate such an ideology. But if you go to any book of a Shia scholar which discusses theology, it will always start, of course pertaining to the Usul ad-Din, with Tawhid, with monotheism. And we say, of course, that we take the Tawhid of the Itra, and this is why we name the channel Tawhid Al-Itra, because their Tawhid, their monotheism, is the only valid monotheism, because their monotheism reflects that taught by Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they clarify which narrations were fabricated against his name, such as Allah Azza wa Jal descending down to the sky, which is a physical type of limited action. So I'll give an example. One book, if I pick up this particular book here, of greater sins. Now, although I may not agree with all the opinions of the author or every part of content within this book, it's a very praiseworthy book in the sense that it compiles narrations of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam to show the consequences and gravity of such sins, the grave consequences of such big sins, and it categorizes them into different chapters. So this book is very good for anyone that wants to read about the big sins and great sins within Islam and how one can stay away from such sins. And if anyone wants the Arabic version, of course, the book is originally in Arabic, and I believe there is a Farsi version as well. However, this is the English version, which many of the viewers can read if they do not read Arabic or Farsi. So this book is good in categorizing the major sins, and there could be various lectures just given on each chapter. So let's say that someone picks up this book. He is not a Shi'i, but he is interested in Shia theology. He'll go to the first chapter. And what would the first chapter be of such a book? Polytheism. Shirk, polytheism, to associate anyone or anything with Allah Azza wa Jal. So this is the very first chapter of this book, which is the same of all the Shia scholars who discuss Usul al-Din and the roots of religion, which has been categorized by the scholars. It talks about Tawhid and avoiding Shirk. And we see on this first page that the author quotes a hadith from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, which says, the greatest of the greater sins is to attribute partners to Allah Azza wa Jal. And this is from Wasa'il al-Shia. So, of course, as we know, sins are categorized into the major sins and the smaller sins. Major sins, some scholars defining as those sins which would take one into hellfire, or which mention hellfire as the punishment. Although the minor sins cannot be taken lightly by the person. They say, just because this sin is lighter in its weight, I'm going to do that. No, a small sin can become a worse sin or a greater sin if someone takes it lightly. But these are the categorizations. So we see on the very first page, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam is quoted as speaking against shirk and saying that it is the greatest of sins. And then the author quotes various verses relating to shirk, which we will not mention now, but we can put the screenshot on the screen for people to read, as we want to try to keep the discussion brief. So any Shia scholar or author, you go to the book and they discuss Usul al-Din, it will come down to condemning shirk. But unfortunately, the nawasib and the opponents try to portray that this isn't the case, and that Shia scholars do not discuss polytheism or Tawhid. And even if we go on to the next page, we see that the author elaborates further in regard to the categories and divisions of Tawhid, how it is divided up. And inshallah ta'ala in future, I may also give a lecture pertaining to the Shia categorizations of Tawhid. So we see on page 82, the author discusses shirk, and he says, every Muslim knows fully well that shirk is a greater sin, so it does not, or the greatest sin, so it does not seem necessary to quote the Quranic ayat and traditions of Ma'sumi in this regard. So he's quoted a few, but there are so many in this regard, as this is something obvious for any Muslim. However, since it is important to understand the true meaning of shirk, we shall quote the relevant statements in order that people may keep aloof from this infamy. The Holy Quran states, وَاعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَلَا تُشْرِكُوا بِهِ شَيْئًا, and worship Allah and do not associate anything with Him, as in Surah An-Nisa, Surah 4, verse 36. And then the author goes to mention some of the categories of Tawheed for the Shia, which we will briefly mention now. So he says, a mushrik, a polytheist, is the opposite of a muwahhid, a monotheist. Tawheed is a primary pillar of faith. So this is a primary pillar that if it is not correct, all other pillars collapse. It has various aspects in the same way that shirk also consists of different types. So first category of Tawheed, how some Shia ulama and shirk, Tawhid and Shirk, they categorize it, is Tawheed in the essence of Allah Azza wa Jal, Tawhid Al-Zhati. So Tawhid and Shirk with regard to the essence of Allah. So to give a description of this, that Allah in His essence is unique, one, He does not have any parts, and no creation is able to comprehend the essence of Allah Azza wa Jal. And the author mentions quickly that Tawheed with regard to the essence denotes confessing that the essence of the Lord of the worlds is one, and that He is eternal, He is the originator of every action and phenomenon, whether perceptible through the senses or not. There is no other cause except Him. And belief in multiple causes is shirk. So he says that the Zoroastrians believe in the existence of two powerful forces in the universe, being both equal and eternal, so the force of evil and the force of good. Such a belief would be shirk if we believe that this force of evil is an internal force and then Allah Azza wa Jal is the eternal good force, because this would then create a partner with Allah Azza wa Jal. So the Tawheed in the essence states that the essence of Allah Azza wa Jal, His Dhat, is completely unique, and to give His Dhat parts, or say that Allah Azza wa Jal is in need of parts, or that He does hulul or goes into a body, would negate the Tawheed of Dhat, of the essence of Allah Azza wa Jal. So this is category 1 when we speak about the Tawheed in the Dhat, the essence of Allah Azza wa Jal. And this is a very brief description, as we could elaborate on this more inshallah ta'ala in the future. The second category that the author discusses is Tawhid and Shirk in the attribute, the Sifat of Allah Azza wa Jal. So we know that Allah Azza wa Jal, His Sifat are not separate from His essence, in the sense that Allah Azza wa Jal is all powerful by His Dhat, He is all known by His Dhat, and He does not have this power added to Him or taken away, or this, for example, knowledge added to Him, power, knowledge taken away or given. Whereas the human being is born weak and dies weak, and the human being, whether it be their power or knowledge, is all those things which are changeable and added to themselves. So Allah Azza wa Jal, as the author says, Tawheed with regards to the attributes of Allah means His realization that the positive attributes of Allah Azza wa Jal. So they divide this discussion into the positive and negative attributes. The negative attributes mean that Allah Azza wa Jal doesn't have anything negative, but they're particular attributes which they cannot be attributed to Allah Azza wa Jal, rather to His creation. So we negate these from Allah Azza wa Jal. That the positive attributes of Allah and His essence have only one and the same sense, and not any multiple and diverse sense. Divine attributes like divine eternity, divine knowledge, and divine power are the same as His essence, without any duality between His essence and attributes. So again, for example, if we said that Ali has knowledge and Allah Azza wa Jal has knowledge, the only comparison there is in the word we're using, whereas the reality is completely different. Allah Azza wa Jal is not limited in His knowledge, He did not gain any knowledge, whereas the human being or any type of creation is limited in their knowledge. They gained this knowledge and they have a need for it in order to carry out their needs, whereas Allah Azza wa Jal, we say by His essence, is all-knowing of everything that can be known, and the human being is limited in this. So the second category is the Tawheed in the attributes, Sifat of Allah Azza wa Jal. And if one would say that these attributes are added to Allah Azza wa Jal like some other sects do, or that these attributes are separate from His essence, such as power, knowledge, etc. So this would negate one's Tawheed of being pure if they would believe in such a belief of attributes being added or negated of Allah Azza wa Jal. And by negated we mean the positive attributes, not the negative things and the blemishes which are for human beings, which we negate from Allah Azza wa Jal. And the third category is Tawhid Al-Afaali, or the Tawheed relating to the acts of Allah Azza wa Jal. And the author says here, Tawheed in deeds construe that we have conviction that the Lord and Master of every form of His life, whether material or spiritual, is Allah Azza wa Jal. So Allah Azza wa Jal is the regulator and creator of everything. He alone controls and regulates life. We must also have conviction that Allah does not have anyone to share in His lordship and control. His authority extends over the entire earth and the skies. No one is accomplice to Him in this world. So Allah Azza wa Jal is the sustainer of everything. If there are any of His creations, such as the angels, which take part in some of the organization or management of affairs, this is because Allah Azza wa Jal has given them permission to do so. Whereas the ultimate cause of everything, who takes and gives life, is Allah Azza wa Jal. So no one should, for example, mix these types of acts and give them to idols, or make anyone else gods or a partner along with Allah Azza wa Jal when it comes to the actions of Allah Azza wa Jal, because He is the ultimate cause which every other creation depends on. The fourth type of Tawheed that the author mentions is the Tawheed of Ibadah, and how one should have Tawheed of Ibadah and not do shirk in this, so that we only worship Allah Azza wa Jal, and He is the only one deserving of full worship and full obedience, in the sense of recognizing Him as a Lord. Yes, Allah Azza wa Jal can give obedience to, for example, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi and to the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, but they are not recognized as lords. It is only Allah Azza wa Jal. And this goes against what the polytheists did in the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in his time, that they made the excuse that they would worship their idols. مَا نَعْبُدُهُمْ إِلَّا لِيُقَرِّبُونَ إِلَى اللَّهِ زُلْفَى, that they would worship their idols to gain closeness to Allah Azza wa Jal. No, the lowly human who owes everything to Allah Azza wa Jal and all his blessings come from Allah Azza wa Jal must worship Allah Azza wa Jal alone. He must worship Allah Azza wa Jal alone and completely submit and devote himself to Allah Azza wa Jal. So in ibadah, one should have Tawheed in ibadah and negate shirk in this aspect. Now the fifth category, in this book it was actually the fourth, and I read the Tawheed of Ibadah before this, but many of the ulama anyway, they make many different categories. This is the final one that we'll just read quickly for the viewers, is Tawheed and Shirk when it comes to ta'ah, obedience. Now we see many of the nawasib, these jahil nawasib, they say that look, disobeying the Imam is shirk for you. So you believe that the Imam is God. And I remember that Dawah man said this, or Dawah boy, and one of the brothers replied to this stupidity. Tawheed and Shirk relating to obedience is mentioned by the author here, where he says, a believer knows that the creator of all is the one and only Allah. He is the only sustainer of all his creatures. He does not have any partner in his lordship and authority. So Allah Azza wa Jal is again the ultimate authority who does not have any partners. Such a believer does not regard anyone else fit for obedience except Allah. So we do not obey any of these tyrants and submit ourselves to man who is in need of Allah Azza wa Jal. The believer knows that apart from Allah, none of the existing things could command obedience. They are all helpless before the might of Allah. All the creatures are incapable of benefiting themselves, nor can they protect themselves from harm. They do not have any power upon their death and life, and neither upon the day of judgment and reckoning. So even if you as a person believe you can benefit someone, yes, we can benefit someone. I can give someone money, I can give someone food, and this is a type of material benefit. But this benefit is only possible due to what Allah Azza wa Jal has given us. So in reality, any benefit which comes from a creation actually goes back to Allah Azza wa Jal, who is the original cause. The author quotes a verse, they control not for themselves any harm or profit, and they control not death nor life, nor raising the dead in brackets back to life. So one might come and say, okay, if the obedience is for Allah Azza wa Jal, then why do we have to obey other than Allah? Now, this is covered in the next paragraph where the author says, thus total obedience and wilayah is reserved for Allah. However, if Allah himself designates someone to be the center of authority, then his obedience is also obligatory due to the divine command. So as we know that Allah Azza wa Jal, and it quotes a verse here, he has given and extended this divine authority as a way of obeying him. So if you obey the messenger, for example, you are obeying Allah Azza wa Jal. If you obey those in authority, the Ulul Amr, as mentioned in the verse of chapter 4, verse 59, you are obeying Allah Azza wa Jal. So it is not that they are partners with Allah Azza wa Jal, they are not partners with Allah Azza wa Jal, rather because of Allah giving them the permission, he has extended this obedience as a way of also obeying him. So this is where someone else should not obey any false god or any tyrant, rather any type of obedience they should have is with the intention of obeying Allah Azza wa Jal. So when I have this obedience, full obedience to the words of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, to the prophets, this is because they are sent by Allah and their obedience equals the obedience of Allah. So when these Jahil Nawasib come and say that, oh, so you have some ahadith that disobeying the Imam means you are doing shirk and that means you worship the Imam. No, ya Jahil. Disobeying the Imam in the sense of shirk in ta'ah is disobeying Allah, because Allah Azza wa Jal gives you these divine guides to follow, yet you do not follow them and think you know better and follow your desires or your man appointed rulers. So that is the meaning of this when we say shirk in obedience. This is one of the categories, and having tawheed in obedience, that having obedience to those that Allah Azza wa Jal has appointed is actually obedience to him. So we've just mentioned in a brief manner some of the categories relating to Tawheed and Shirk, and inshallah ta'ala in the next episode we shall proceed with our discussion relating to those who utter kufr and what our opinion is about these eulogy reciters that do so. To conclude and finish the episode, I will just mention these categories again in order, and then inshallah ta'ala one can tune into the next episode where we will go into this topic of the Shia scholars and what they say about the ghulat, or those extremists who utter exaggeration about the Imams. So as we said, there was Tawhid and Shirk with regard to the essence of Allah, Tawhid and Shirk with regard to the attributes, the Sifat of Allah, Tawhid and Shirk in actions, Tawhid and Shirk in obedience, and Tawhid and Shirk in worship. These are 5 categories. As I said, ulama categorize them more, but if anyone wants to read more on this and the detailed proofs that he put, then they can read this book, inshallah ta'ala. But this was just to show that when the opponents try to claim that the Shia do not speak about Tawhid and Shirk, you will go to many texts where that is the first topic being spoke about. And this is upon us to emphasize more on, so that the ghulat cannot corrupt our gatherings. Because if one has a good knowledge of Tawhid according to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Ahlul Bayt alayhim assalam, they will not fall for the deviant Shirk type of ideology being promoted by these extremists in some of our gatherings. So please join me for the next episode where we will continue our discussion. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajjil farajahum wa la'ana a'dahum.